Pick up a head of garlic from the shelf of your nearest supermarket and look at the small sticker on the bottom. There's a very good chance it says, "Product of China," and before that head ended up in your shopping cart, it traveled almost halfway around the world, roughly 6,000 miles by sea across the Pacific Ocean. That's strange, because in the American imagination, garlic is something deeply local: an Italian grandmother in the kitchen, a small farm in California, a modest farmer's market. There's even an entire town that officially calls itself the garlic capital of the world. And here's the twist. That very same American town, the one that gave the world its garlic cult, nearly lost the battle over its own product over the past 30 years. And the reason has nothing to do with taste or quality. The reason is one of the longest trade investigations in the history of the U.S. Department of Commerce, lawsuits over laundering harvests through third countries, and a tariff war that hasn't ended even today. Let's break down how an ordinary head of garlic became the subject of genuine international price espionage. The story doesn't begin in China, but in a small valley south of San Francisco, in the town of Gilroy, California. Back in the 1890s, Southern European immigrants, mostly Italians and Portuguese, settled here, for whom growing garlic in a kitchen garden was simply a natural part of life. Garlic became a commercial business in the Santa Clara Valley in 1929, when Japanese immigrant Kiyoshi Hirosaki began growing and selling garlic alongside other vegetables. Over the following decade, Hirosaki converted nearly all of his land to garlic, and by the 1940s he ran the largest commercial garlic farm in the country. The next pivotal moment came in 1956, when brothers Don and Art Christopher, descendants of Swedish immigrants, left the family plum orchard, moved 10 miles south, and focused entirely on growing garlic. The company they founded, Christopher Ranch, would eventually become the largest producer of fresh garlic in the entire country. In 1979, a local doctor named Rudy Maloney proposed the idea of a festival that would turn a humble crop into a tourist event. The first Gilroy Garlic Festival drew 15,000 visitors. Today, it's one of America's most famous food festivals, and Gilroy officially and unofficially carries the title of Garlic Capital of the World. Industry estimates suggest a significant share of all American garlic is still grown in this valley, and most of the national harvest is processed at local plants. It looked like a perfect American success story. But right at the moment Gilroy reached the peak of its fame, a competitor emerged on the other side of the Pacific that no California farm could match on price. In the early 1990s, China was rapidly becoming the world's largest garlic producer. Today, according to industry analysts' estimates, it accounts for roughly 80% of the global harvest. Cheap land, enormous amounts of manual labor, and government export support allowed Chinese producers to sell garlic at prices American farms simply couldn't match. According to Ken Christopher, a third-generation representative of the Christopher Ranch ownership, American garlic sold for about $40 a box in the 1990s. Chinese garlic flooded the market at the same time for about $10 a box, 4 times cheaper. For American farmers, this wasn't just competitive pressure, it was a direct threat to the survival of the entire industry. In February 1994, a group of American garlic producers, including Christopher Ranch, Valley Garlic, The Garlic Company, and Vesey & Company, filed a formal complaint with the U.S. Department of Commerce. They claimed that Chinese garlic was being sold in America at prices artificially set below cost. Legally, this is called dumping. The investigation confirmed the complaint. The U.S. International Trade Commission found that the American garlic industry had suffered substantial economic harm precisely because of Chinese garlic imports priced below fair market value. On November 16, 1994, the Department of Commerce officially imposed an anti-dumping duty on fresh garlic from China, and it turned out to be one of the highest in the entire history of American trade policy, over 375% of the product's value. This duty wasn't a one-time decision. Every 5 years, the law requires the International Trade Commission to review whether it should be revoked. And every 5 years, in 2001, 2006, 2011, 2017, and most recently in 2023, the Commission reached the same conclusion. Revoking the duty would inevitably lead to renewed dumping and fresh harm to American farmers. The duty, introduced under President Bill Clinton, remains in effect today, nearly 30 years later, but a 375% duty isn't an impenetrable wall. It's an incentive to find loopholes. And a loophole was found in the very mechanism of the law itself. Every year, new Chinese exporting companies that had not previously supplied garlic to the U.S. are entitled to apply for a so-called new shipper review and receive an individual, usually much lower duty rate. This provision exists precisely so genuinely new market entrants aren't punished. The problem, according to claims made by American producers in lawsuits, is that this mechanism began to be abused. A lawsuit filed by Harmony International Spice alleged that some Chinese suppliers systematically registered new legal entities, or revived effectively dormant companies, specifically to repeatedly obtain new shipper status and its preferential duty rate, then funnel enormous volumes of garlic grown by entirely different producers who should have been paying the full rate, through them. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, handling matters of international trade, reviewed this case for years. The panel of judges issued its final ruling only in 2020. A similar economic logic, minus the legal complexities, has occasionally surfaced on the other side of the Atlantic as well. In Britain in 2012, a man was sentenced to 6 years in prison for declaring containers of Chinese garlic as duty-free ginger for more than 2 years, avoiding roughly £2 million in duties. That same year in Ireland, the head of the country's largest fruit and vegetable company was sentenced to 6 years in prison for importing more than 1,000 tons of Chinese garlic disguised as apples. And a bit later, Swedish prosecutors issued international arrest warrants for 2 British men who brought Chinese garlic into Norway, where the duty didn't apply, then trucked it across the border into Sweden and the rest of the European Union, avoiding, according to investigators' estimates, roughly €10 million in duties. These aren't American cases, but they illustrate one thing. When the price gap on garlic is measured in hundreds of % of duty, an ordinary agricultural miracle turns into the object of a genuine smuggling economy. Even garlic that clears all customs procedures entirely legally still travels an extraordinarily long path. The sea distance from China's main garlic-growing regions, particularly Jingxiang County in Shandong Province, to the U.S. West Coast is roughly 6,000 miles, which is where this video's title comes from. The sea voyage takes weeks, and for the harvest to survive it without rotting or pests, garlic is required by U.S. law to undergo mandatory phytosanitary treatment, overseen by the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. The most common method is methyl bromide fumigation, a gas that kills insect pests, carried out in specially certified and tightly controlled chambers. This isn't some secret practice. It's an official, documented procedure applied to a large share of imported fruits and vegetables, not just garlic. But alongside this, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has maintained a separate import alert, specifically for garlic from China since the mid-1990s. Over the years, dozens of shipments of fresh and processed garlic have been held at the border over insects, mold, or other contamination, and some suppliers remain on a list whose goods customs automatically detains without physical inspection until the company proves compliance with standards. This doesn't mean all imported garlic is unsafe, but it does mean that 6,000 miles of sea travel and weeks in a ship's hold leave far more room for problems than a short truck ride from the Gilroy Valley to your nearest supermarket. Meanwhile, the balance of power in the market kept shifting. In June 2007, NPR reported a symbolic milestone. For the first time in history, the United States bought more garlic from China than it grew itself in California. The town that called itself the garlic capital of the world had formally stopped being the largest garlic supplier for its own country. The situation only began to change a decade later, and the push came not from a fight over flavor, but from major trade policy. In 2018, the administration of President Donald Trump imposed an additional duty, first 10%, then 25%, on a wide range of Chinese goods, including garlic, as part of the broader U.S.-China trade war. For Christopher Ranch in Gilroy, this turned into an unexpected windfall. According to Ken Christopher, the company received so many new orders that it had to add extra shifts just to keep up with cleaning, sorting, and packing 50,000 additional pounds of garlic straight from cold storage. As of 2019, only about 6% of the garlic the company sold was still sourced from China. The rest was grown at home, in California. Ken Christopher told reporters directly at the time that his ideal scenario was for the duty to become so high that Chinese suppliers would simply start giving up on containers bound for the U.S. and look for other markets. In other words, a farmer whose family had spent 30 years fighting dumping prices through the courts was openly celebrating a trade war that was, at the same time, hurting many other American farmers, those growing cotton, nuts, or grapes. This story isn't just about a vegetable. It's a story about how an ordinary product from your kitchen cupboard ended up at the center of one of the longest trade investigations in the history of the U.S. Department of Commerce, lawsuits over shell companies, and a tariff war that has now outlasted several presidential terms in a row. Garlic from Gilroy and garlic from Shandong look almost identical on a supermarket shelf, but behind that resemblance lie 30 years of customs battles, millions of dollars in duties, and an entire enforcement infrastructure deciding whether any given shipment gets to cross the border at all. Next time you buy garlic, try flipping over the bag or the bulb and reading where it actually came from. Chances are the answer will surprise you more than the recipe you bought it for. If this story changed the way you look at an ordinary head of garlic in your shopping cart, hit like. It's the best way to help this channel reach more people. And let me know in the comments, have you ever checked where the garlic you buy actually comes from? I read every comment.